Welcome to Exploration Dreamland, a quiet read-aloud of the writings of explorers of the real world and the worlds of imagination. Drop anchor, relax into your comfortable bunk, and drift off to Dreamland with us as we read Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton. If you would like to stay in touch between episodes, you can follow us on Instagram and Twitter at Exploration Dreamland. If you would like to recommend a text, please email us at explorationdreamland, all one word, @gmail.com. The first season of this podcast is dedicated to the memory of my friend, Ed Sears. He was a runner, coach, science enthusiast, and science fiction aficionado who was often gently encouraging of my crazy ideas. Now, take a deep breath in, and as you exhale, relax any tension in your muscles. Close your eyes. Snuggle into your sleeping space and listen to tonight's tale. Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton, originally published in 1960. Chapter 13. He Who Dreams. The mist was not a quiet thing. It billowed and curled until it appeared to half conceal darker shadows, any one of which could be an enemy. Shan remained hunkered on the sand, every sense abnormally alert, watching the fog. He was still sure he could hear sounds which marked the progress of another. What other? One of the Warlockians tracking him to spy? Or was there some prisoner like himself lost out there in the murk? Could it be Torvald? Now the sound had ceased. He was not even sure from what direction it had first come. Perhaps that other was listening now, as intent upon locating him. Shan ran his tongue over dry lips. The impulse to call out, to try and contact any fellow traveler here, was strong. Only hard-learned caution kept him silent. He got to his hands and knees, uncertain as to his previous direction. Shan crept. Someone expecting a man walking erect might be suitably distracted by the arrival of a half-seen figure on all fours. He halted again to listen. He had been right. The sound of a very muffled footfall or footfalls carried to his ears. He was sure that the sound was louder, that the unknown was approaching. Shan stood, his hand close to his stunner. He was almost tempted to spray that beam blindly before him, hoping to hit the unseen by chance. A shadow, something more swift than a shadow, more than one of the tricks the curling fog played on his eyes, was moving with purpose and straight for him. Still, prudence restrained Shan from calling out. The figure grew clearer. A Terran. It could be Torvald. But remembering how they had last parted, Shan did not hurry to meet him. That shadow shape stretched out a long arm in a sweep as if to pull aside some of the vapor concealing them from each other. Then Shan shivered as if that fog had suddenly turned into the drive of frigid snow. For the mist did roll back so that the two of them stood in an irregular clearing in its midst, and he did not front Torvald. Shan was caught up in the ice grip of an old fear, frozen by it, but somehow clinging to a hope that he did not see the unbelievable. those hands drawing the lash of a whip back into striking readiness, a brutal nose broken askew, a blaster burn puckering across cheek to misshapen ear, that evil, gloating grin of anticipation. Flick, flick, the slight dance of the lash in a master's hand as those thick fingers tightened about the stock of the whip. In a moment it would whirl up to lay a ribbon of fire about Shan's defenseless shoulders. Then Logali would laugh and laugh, his sadistic mirth echoed by those other men who played jackals to his rogue lion. Other men. Shan shook his head dazedly, but he did not stand again in the dump-size bar of the big strike, and he was no longer a terrorized youngster, fit meat for Logali's amusement. Only the whip rose, the lash curled out, catching Shan just as it had that time years ago, delivering a red slash of pure agony. But Logali was dead. Shan's mind screamed, fighting frantically against the evidence of his eyes, of that pain in his chest and shoulder. The dump bully had been spaced by off-world miners, now also dead, whose claims he had tried to jump out in the Ajax system. Logali drew back the lash, preparing to strike again. Shan faced a man 5 years dead who walked and fought. Or Shan bit hard upon his lower lip, holding desperately to sane reasoning. Did he indeed face anything? Logali was the ancient devil of his boyhood, produced anew by the witchery of Warlock. Or had Shan himself been led to recreate both the man and the circumstances of their first meeting with fear as a weapon to pull the creator down? Dream true or false? Logali was dead, therefore this dream was false. It had to be. The Terran began to walk toward that grinning ogre rising out of his old nightmares. His hand was no longer on the butt of his stunner, but swung loosely at his side. He saw the coming lash, the wicked promise in those small, narrowed eyes. This was Logali at the acme of his strength, when he was most to be feared, as he had continued to exist over the years in the depths of a boy-child's memory. But Logali was not alive. Only in a dream could he be. For the second time, the lash bit at Shan, curling about his body to dissolve. There was no alteration in Logali's grin. His muscular arm drew back as he aimed a third blow. Shan continued to walk forward, bringing up one hand, not to strike at that sweating, bristly jaw, but as if to push the other out of his path. And in his mind he held one thought. This was not Logali. It could not be. 10 years had passed since they had met, and for 5 of those years Logali had been dead. Here was Warlockian witchery, to be met by sane Terran reasoning. Shan was alone. The mist, which had formed walls, enclosed him again, but still there was a smarting brand across his shoulder. Shan drew aside the rags of his uniform blouse to discover a welt, raw and red, and seeing that, his unbelief was shaken. When he had believed in Logali and in Logali's weapon, the other had had reality enough to strike that blow, make the lash cut deep. But when the Terran had faced the phantom with the truth, then neither Logali nor his lash existed. Shan shivered, trying not to think what might lie before him. Visions out of nightmares which could put on substance. He had dreamed of Logali in the past, many times, and he had had other dreams, just as frightening. Must he front those nightmares, all of them? Why? To amuse his captors, or to prove their contention that he was a fool to challenge the powers of such mistresses of illusion? How did they know just what dreams to use in order to break him? Or did he himself furnish the actors and the action, projecting old terrors in this mist as a 3D tape projected a story in 3 dimensions for the amusement of the viewer? Dream true. Was this progress through the mist also a dream? Dreams within dreams. Shan put his hand to his head, uncertain, badly shaken. But that stubborn core of determination within him was still holding. Next time he would be prepared at once to face down any resurrected memory. Walking slowly, pausing to listen for the slightest sound which might herald the coming of a new illusion, Shan tried to guess which of his nightmares might come to face him. But he was to learn that there was more than one kind of dream. Steeled against old fears, he was met by another emotion altogether. There was a fluttering in the air, a little crooning cry which pulled at his heart. Without any conscious thought, Shan held out his hands, whistling on 2 notes a call which his lips appeared to remember more quickly than his mind. The shape which winged through the fog came straight to his waiting hold, tore at long walled-away hurt with its once familiar beauty. It flew with a list. One of the delicately tinted wings was injured, had never healed straight. But the seraph nestled into the hollow of Shan's 2 palms and looked up at him with all the old liquid trust. Trav! Trav! He cradled the tiny creature carefully, regarded with joy its feathered body, the curled plumes on its proudly held head, felt the silken patting of those infinitesimal claws against his protecting fingers. Shan sat down in the sand, hardly daring to breathe. Trav, again! The wonder of this never-to-be-hoped-for return filled him with a surge of happiness almost too great to bear, which hurt in its way with as great a pain as Logali's lash. It was a pain rooted in love, not fear and hate. Logali's lash. Shan trembled. Trav raised one of those small claws toward the Terran's face, crooning a soft, caressing cry for recognition, for protection, trying to be a part of Shan's life once more. Trav, how could he bear to will Trav into nothingness, to bear to summon up another harsh memory which would sweep Trav away? Trav was the only thing Shan had ever known which he could love wholeheartedly, that had answered his love with a return gift of affection so much greater than the light body he now held. Trav, he whispered softly. Then he made his great effort against this second and far more subtle attack. With the same agony which he had known years earlier, he resolutely summoned a bitter memory, sat nursing once more a broken thing which died in pain he could not ease, aware himself of every moment of that pain. And what was worse, this time there clung that nagging little doubt. What if he had not forced the memory? Perhaps he could have taken Trav with him, unhurt, alive, at least for a while. Shan covered his face with his now empty hands. To see a nightmare flicker out after facing squarely up to its terror, that was no great task. To give up a dream which was part of a lost heaven, that cut cruelly deep. The Terran dragged himself to his feet, drained and weary, stumbling on. Was there no end to this aimless circling through a world of green smoke? He shambled ahead, moving his feet leadenly. How long had he been here? There was no division in time, just the unchanging light which was a part of the fog through which he plodded. Then he heard more than any shuffle of foot across sand, any crooning of a long-dead seraph, the rising and falling of a voice, a human voice, not quite singing or reciting, but something between the two. Shan paused, searching his memory, a memory which seemed bruised, for the proper answer to match that sound. But though he recalled scene after scene out of the years, that voice did not trigger any return from his past. He turned toward its source, dully determined to get over quickly the meeting which lay behind that signal. Only, though he walked on and on, Shan did not appear any closer to the man behind the voice, nor was he able to make out separate words composing that chant, a chant broken now and then by pauses, so that the Terran grew aware of the distress of his fellow prisoner, for the impression that he sought another captive came out of nowhere and grew as he cast wider and wider in his quest. Then he might have turned some invisible corner in the mist, for the chant broke out anew in stronger volume, and now he was able to distinguish words he knew. Where blow the winds between the worlds, and hang the suns in dark of space, for power is given a man to use. Let him do so well before the last accounting. The voice was hoarse, cracked, the words spaced with uneven catches of breath, as if they had been repeated many, many times to provide an anchor against madness, form a tie to reality. And hearing that note, Shan slowed his pace. This was out of no memory of his, he was sure of that. Blow the winds between the worlds, and hang the suns in dark of... That harsh croak of voice was running down, as a clock runs down for lack of winding. Shan sped on, reacting to a plea which did not lay in the words themselves. Once more the mist curled back, provided him with an open space. A man sat on the sand, his fists buried wrist-deep in the smooth grains on either side of his body, his eyes set, red-rimmed, glazed, his body rocking back and forth in time to his labored chant. The dark of space. Torvald! Shan skidded in the sand, went down on his knees. The manner of their last parting was forgotten as he took in the officer's condition. The other did not stop his swaying, but his head turned with a stiff jerk, the gray eyes making a visible effort to focus on Shan. Then some of the strain smoothed out of the gaunt features, and Torvald laughed softly. Garth. Shan stiffened, but had no chance to protest that mistaken identification as the other continued. So you made Class 1 status, boy. I always knew you could if you'd work for it. A couple of black marks on your record, sure. But those can be rubbed out, boy, when you're willing to try. Torvalds always have been survey. Our father would have been proud. Torvald's voice flattened. His smile faded. There was a growing spark of some emotion in those gray eyes. Unexpectedly, he hurled himself forward, his hands clawing for Shan's throat. He bore the younger man down under him to the sand, where Altinay found himself fighting desperately for his life against a man who could only be mad. Jeanne used a trick learned on the dumps, and his opponent doubled up with a gasp of agony to let the younger man break free. He planted a knee on the small of Torvald's back, digging the officer into the sand, pinning down his arms in spite of the other's struggles. Regaining his own breath in gulps, Jeanne tried to appeal to some spark of reason in the other. "Torvald, this is Altinay." His name echoed in the mist-walled void like an unhuman wail. "Altinay, no, Throg. Altinay, Throg killed my brother." Sand puffed out with the breath which expelled that indictment, but Torvald no longer fought, and Jeanne believed him close to collapse. Jeanne relaxed his hold, rolling the other man over. Torvald obeyed his pull limply, lying face upward, sand in his hair and eyebrows, crusting his slack lips. The younger man brushed the dirt away gently as the other opened his eyes to regard Jeanne with his old impersonal stare. "You're alive," Torvald stated bleakly. "Garth's dead. You ought to be dead, too." Jeanne drew back, rubbed sand from his hands, his concern dampened by the other's patent hostility. Only that angry accusation vanished in a blink of those gray eyes. Then there was a warmer recognition in Torvald's expression. "Altinay," the younger man might just have come into sight. "What are you doing here?" Jeanne tightened his belt. "Just about what you are." He was still aloof, giving no acknowledgement of difference in rank now. "Running around in this fog, hunting the way out." Torvald sat up, surveying the billowing walls of the hole which contained them. Then he reached out a hand to draw fingers down Jeanne's forearm. "You are real," he observed simply, and his voice was warm, welcoming. "Don't bet on it," Jeanne snapped. "The unreal can be mighty real here." His hand went up to the smarting brand on his shoulder. Torvald nodded. "Masters of illusion," he murmured. "Mistresses," Jeanne corrected. "This place is run by a gang of pretty smart witches." "Witches? You've seen them? Where? And what? Who are they?" Torvald pounced with a return of his old-time sharpness. "They're females right enough, and they can make the impossible happen. I'd say that classifies them as witches. One of them tried to take me over back on the island. I set a trap and caught her. Then somehow she transported me." Swiftly he outlined the chain of events leading from his sudden awakening in the river tunnel to his present penetration of this fog world. Torvald listened eagerly. When the story was finished, he rubbed his hands across his drawn face, smearing away the last of the sand. "At least you have some idea of who they are and a suggestion of how you got here. I don't remember that much about my own arrival. As far as I can remember, I went to sleep on the island and woke up here." Jeanne studied him and knew that Torvald was telling the truth. He could remember nothing of his departure in the outrigger, the way he had fought Jeanne in the lagoon. The survey officer must have been under the control of the Warlockians then. Quickly, he gave the older man his version of the other's actions in the outer world, and Torvald was clearly astounded, though he did not question the facts Jeanne presented. "They just took me," Torvald said in a husky half-whisper. But why? And why are we here? Is this a prison? Shan shook his head. I think all this, a wave of his hand encompassed the green wall, what lay beyond it and in it, is a test of some kind. This dream business. A little while ago I got to thinking that I wasn't here at all, that I might be dreaming it all. Then I met you. Torvald understood. Yes, but this could be a dream meeting. How can we tell? He hesitated almost diffidently before he asked, Have you met anyone else here? Yes. Shan had no desire to go into that. People out of your past life? Yes. Again, he did not elaborate. So did I. Torvald's expression was bleak. His encounters in the fog must have proved no more pleasant than Shan's. That suggests that we do trigger the hallucinations ourselves, but maybe we can really lick it now. How? Well, if these phantoms are born of our memories, there are about only 2 or 3 we could see together. Maybe a throg on the rampage, or that hound we left back in the mountains. And if we do sight anything like that, we'll know what it is. On the other hand, if we stick together and one of us sees something that the other can't, well, that fact alone will explode the ghost. There was sense in what he said. Shan aided the officer to his feet. I must be a better subject for their experiments than you, the older man remarked ruefully. They took me over completely at the first. You were carrying that disc, Shan pointed out. Maybe that acted as a focusing lens for whatever power they used to make us play trained animals. Could be. Torvald brought out the cloth-wrapped bone coin. I still have it. But he made no move to pull off the bit of rag about it. Now, he gazed at the wall of green. Which way? Shan shrugged. Long ago he had lost any idea of keeping a straight course through the murk. He might have turned around any number of times since he first walked blindly into this place. Then he pointed to the packet Torvald held. Why not flip that? He asked. Heads we go that way? He indicated the direction in which they were facing. Tails we do right about face. There was an answering grin on Torvald's lips. As good a guide as any we're likely to find here. We'll do it. He pulled away the twist of cloth, and with a swift snap, reminiscent of that used by the Warlockian witch to empty the bowl of sticks, he tossed the disc into the air. It spun, whirled, but to their open-jawed amazement, it did not fall to the sand. Instead, it spun until it looked like a small globe instead of a disc, and it lost its dead white for a glow of green. When that glow became dazzling for Terran eyes, the miniature sun swung out, not in orbit, but in straight line of flight, heading to their right. With a muffled cry, Torvald started in pursuit, Shan running beside him. They were in a tunnel of the fog now, and the pace set by the spinning coin was swift. The Terrans continued to follow it at the best pace they could summon, having no idea of where they were headed, but each with the hope that they finally did have a guide to lead them through this place of confusion and into a sane world where they could face on more equal terms those who had sent them there. Chapter 14. Escape. Something ahead. Torvald did not slacken the pace set by the brilliant spot of green they trailed. Both of the Terrans feared to fall behind, to lose touch with that guide. Their belief that somehow the traveling disc would bring them to the end of the mist and its attendant illusions had grown firmer with every foot of ground they traversed. A dark fixed point, now partly veiled by mist, lay beyond, and it was toward that looming half-shadow that the spinning disc hurtled. Now the mist curled away to display its bulk, larger, blacker, and 4 or 5 times Torvald's height. Both men stopped short, for the disc no longer played Pathfinder. It still whirled on its axis in the air, faster and faster, until it appeared to be throwing off sparks. But the sparks faded against a monolith of dark rock, unlike the native stone they had seen elsewhere. For it was neither red nor warmly brown, but a dull, dead black. It could have been a huge stone slab, trimmed, smoothed, set up on end as a monument or marker, except that only infinite labor could have accomplished such a task, and there was no valid reason for such toil as far as the Terrans could perceive. This is it. Torvald moved closer. By the disc's action, they deduced that their guide had drawn them to this featureless black steel with the precision of a beam-controlled ship. However, the purpose still eluded them. They had hoped for some exit from the territory of the Vale, but now they faced a solid slab of dark stone, neither a conventional exit or entrance, as they proved by circling its base. Beneath their boots was the eternal sand, around them the fog. Now what? Shan asked. They had made their trip about the slab and were back again where the disc whirled with unceasing vigor in a shower of emerald sparks. Torvald shook his head, scanning the rock face before them glumly. The eagerness had gone out of his expression, a vast weariness replacing it. There must have been some purpose in coming here, he replied, but his tone had lost the assurance of moments earlier. Well, if we strike away from here, we'll just get right back in again. Shan waved a hand toward the mist, waiting as if with a hunter's watch upon them. And we certainly can't go down. He dug a boot toe into the sand to demonstrate the folly of that. So what about up? He ducked under the spinning disc to lay his hands against the surface of the giant slab, and in so doing he made a discovery, revealed to his touch although hidden from sight. For his fingers, running aimlessly across the cold, slightly uneven surface of the stone, slipped into a hollow, quite a deep hollow. Excited, half fearing that his sudden guess might be wrong, Shan slid his hand higher in line with that hollow to discover a second. The first had been level with his chest, the second perhaps 18 inches or so above. He jumped to draw his fingers down the rock, with damage to his nails but getting his proof. There was a third niche, deep enough to hold more than just the toe of a boot, and a fourth above that. We've a ladder of sorts here, he reported. Without waiting for any answer from Torvald, Shan began to climb. The holds were so well matched in shape and size that he was sure they could not be natural. They had been bored there for use, the use to which he was now putting them, a ladder to the top of the slab, though what he might find there was beyond his power to imagine. The disc did not rise. Shan passed that core of light, climbing above it into the greater gloom. But the holes did not fail him. Each was waiting in a direct line with its companion. And to an active man, the scramble was not difficult. He reached the summit, glanced around, and made a quick grab for a secure handhold. Waiting for him was no level platform such as he had confidently expected to find. The surface up which he had just made his way fly fashion was the outer wall of a well or chimney. He looked down now into a pit where black nothingness began within a yard of the top, for the radiance of the mist did not penetrate far into that descent. Jeanne fought an attack of giddiness. It would be very easy to lose control, to tumble over and be swallowed up in what might well be a bottomless chasm. And what was the purpose of this well? Was it a trap to entice a prisoner into an unwary climb and then let gravity drag him over? The whole setup was meaningless. Perhaps meaningless only to him, Jeanne conceded with a flash of level thinking. The situation could be quite different as far as the natives were concerned. This structure did have a reason, or it would never have been erected in the first place. "What's the matter?" Torvald's voice was rough with impatience. "This thing's a well." Jeanne edged about a fraction to call back. "The inside is open, and, as far as I can tell, goes clear to the planet's core." "Ladder on the inside, too?" Jeanne squirmed. That was, of course, a very obvious supposition. He kept a tight hold with his left hand, and with the other he did some exploring. Yes, here was a hollow right enough, twin to those on the outside. But to swing over that narrow edge of safety and begin a descent into the black of the well was far harder than any action he had taken since the morning the Throgs had raided the camp. The green mist could hold no terrors greater than those with which his imagination peopled the depths now waiting to engulf him. But Jeanne swung over, fitted his boot into the first hollow, and started down. The only encouragement he gained during that nightmare ordeal was that those holes were regularly spaced. But somehow his confidence did not feed on that fact. There always remained the nagging fear that when he searched for the next, it would not be there, and he would cling to his perch, lacking the needful strength in aching arms and legs to reclimb the inside ladder. He was fast losing that sense of well-being which had been his during his travels through the fog. A fatigue tugged at his arms and weighed leaden on his shoulders. Mechanically he prospected for the next hold, and then the next. Above, the oblong of half-light grew smaller and smaller, sometimes half blotted out by the movements of Torvald's body as the other followed him down that interior way. How far was down? Jeanne giggled light-headedly at the humor of that, or what seemed to be humor at the moment. He was certain that they were now below the level of the sand floor outside the slab, and yet no end had come to the well hollow. No break of light down here. He might have been sightless. But just as the blind develop an extra perceptive sense of unseen obstacles, so did Jeanne now find that he was aware of a change in the nature of the space about him. His weary arms and legs held him against the solidity of a wall, yet the impression that there was no longer another wall at his back grew stronger with every niche which swung him downward. And he was as sure as if he could see it that he was now in a wide-open space, another cavern, perhaps, but this one totally dark. Deprived of sight, he relied upon his ears, and there was a sound, faint, distorted perhaps by the acoustics of this place, but keeping up a continuous murmur. Water. Not the wash of waves with their persistent beat, but rather the rippling of a running stream. Water must lie below. And just as his weariness had grown with his leaving behind the fog, so now did both hunger and thirst gnaw at Shan all the sharper for the delay. The Terran wanted to reach that water, could picture it in his mind, putting away the possibility, the probability, that it might be sea-born and salt and so unfit to drink. The upper opening to the cavern of the fog was now so far above him that he had to strain to see it, and that warmth which had been there was gone. A dank chill wrapped him here, dampened the holds to which he clung until he was afraid of slipping. While the murmur of the water grew louder until its slap-slap sounded within arm's distance, his boot toe skidded from a niche. Shan fought to hold on with numbed fingers. The other foot went. He swung by his hands, kicking vainly to regain a measure of footing. Then his arms could no longer support him, and he cried out as he fell. Water closed about him with an icy shock which for a moment paralyzed him. He flailed out, fighting the flood to get his head above the surface where he could gasp in precious gulps of air. There was a current here, a swiftly running one. Shan remembered the one which had carried him into that cavern in which the Warlockians had their strange dwelling. Although there were no clusters of crystals in this tunnel to supply him with light, the Terran began to nourish a faint hope that he was again in the same stream, that those light crystals would appear, and that he might eventually return to the starting point of this meaningless journey. So he strove only to keep his head above water. Hearing a splashing behind him, he called out, "Torvald?" "Lante?" The answer came back at once. The splashing grew louder as the other swam to catch up. Shan swallowed a mouthful of the water lapping against his chin. The taste was brackish, but not entirely salt, and though it stung his lips, the liquid relieved a measure of his thirst. Only no glowing crystals appeared to stud these walls, and Shan's hope that they were on their way to the cavern of the island faded. The current grew swifter, and he had to fight to keep his head above water, his tired body reacting sluggishly to commands. The murmur of the racing flood drummed louder in his ears. Or was that sound the same? He could no longer be sure. Shan only knew that it was close to impossible to snatch the necessary breath as he was rolled over and over in the hurrying flood. In the end, he was ejected into blazing, blinding light, into a suffocation of wild water as the bullet in an ancient Terran rifle might have been fired at no specific target. Gasping, beaten, more than half drowned, Shan was pummeled by waves, literally driven up on a rocky surface which skinned his body cruelly. He lay there, his arms moving feebly until he contrived to raise himself in time to be wretchedly sick. Somehow he crawled on a few feet farther before he subsided again, blinded by the light, flinching from the heat of the rocks on which he lay, but unable to do more for himself. His first coherent thought was that his speculation concerning the reality of this experience was at last resolved. This could not possibly be an hallucination. At least this particular sequence of events was not. And he was still hazily considering that when a hand fell on his shoulder, fingers biting into his raw flesh. Shan snarled, rolled over on his side. Torvald, water dripping from his rags, or rather steaming from them, his shaggy hair plastered to his skull, sat there. "You all right?" Shan sat up in turn, shielding his smarting eyes. He was bruised, battered badly enough, but he could claim no major injuries. "I think so. Where are we?" Torvald's lips stretched across his teeth in what was more a grimace than a smile. "Right off the map. Any map I know. Take a look." They were on a scrap of beach which was more like a reef, for it lacked any covering comparable to sand except for some cupfuls of coarse gravel locked in rock depressions. Rocks, red as the rust of dried blood, rose in fantastic water-sculptured shapes around the small, semi-level space they had somehow won. This space was V-shaped, washed by equal streams on either side of the prong of rock by water which spouted from the face of a sheer cliff not too far away, with force enough to spray several feet beyond its exit point. Shan, seeing that and guessing at its significance, drew a deep breath and heard the ghost of an answering chuckle from his companion. "Yes, that's where we came out, boy. Like to make a return trip?" Shan shook his head and then wished that he had not so rashly made that move, for the world swung in a dizzy whirl. Things had happened too fast. For the moment it was enough that they were out of the underground ways, back under the amber sky, feeling the bite of Warlock's sun. Steadying his head with both hands, Shan turned slowly to survey what might lie at their backs. The water pouring by on either side suggested that they were again on an island. Warlock, he thought gloomily, seemed to be for Terrans a succession of islands, all hard to escape. The tangle of rocks did not encourage any exploration. Just gazing at them added to his weariness. They rose tier by tier to a ragged crown against the sky. Shan continued to sit staring at them. "To climb that..." His voice trailed into the silence of complete discouragement. "You climb or swim," Torvald stated, but Shan noted the survey officer was not in a hurry to make either move. Nowhere in that wilderness of rock was there the least relieving bit of purple foliage, nor did any clack-clacks or leather-headed birds tour the sky over their heads. Shan's thirst might have been partially assuaged, but his hunger remained, and it was that need which forced him at last into action. The barren heights promised nothing in the way of food, but remembering the harvest the wolverines had taken from under the rocks along the river, he got to his feet and lurched out on the reef which had been their salvation, hunting some pool which might hold an edible captive or two. So it was that Shan made the discovery of a possible path consisting of a ledge running toward the other end of the island, if this were an island where they had taken refuge. The spray of the water drenched that way, feeding small pools in the uneven surface, and strips of yellow weed trailed in slimy ribbons back below the surface of the waves. He called to Torvald and gestured to his find, and then, close together, linking hands when the going became hazardous, the men followed the path. Twice they made finds in the pools, finned or clawed grotesque creatures, which they killed and ate, wolfing down the few fragments of odd-tasting flesh. Then, in a small crevice, which could hardly be dignified by the designation of cave, Torvald chanced upon a quite exciting discovery, a clutch of 4 greenish eggs, each as large as his doubled fist. Their outer covering was more like tough membrane than true shell, and the Terrans worried it open with difficulty. Shan shut his eyes, trying not to think of what he mouthed as he sucked his share dry. At least that semi-liquid stayed put in his middle, though he expected disastrous results from the experiment. More than a little heartened by this piece of luck, they kept on, though the ledge changed from a reasonably level surface to a series of rising unequal steps, drawing them away from the water. At long last they came to the end of that path. Shan leaned back against a convenient spur of rock. "Company," he alerted Torvald. The survey officer joined him to share an outcrop of rock from which they were provided with an excellent view of the scene below, and it was a scene to hold their full attention. That soft sweep of sand which had floored the cavern of the fog lay here also, a grey-blue carpet sloping gently out of the sea. For Shan had no doubt that the wide stretch of water before them was the Western Ocean, walling the beach on either side and extending well out into the water so that the farthest piles were awash except for their crowns, were pillars of stone, shaped with the same finish as that slab which had provided them a ladder of escape. And because of the regularity of their spacing, Shan did not believe them works of nature. Grouped between them now were the players of the drama. One of the Warlockian witches, her gem body patterns glittering in the sunlight, was walking backward out of the sea, her hands held palms together, breast high, in a Terran attitude of prayer. And following her, something swam in the water, clearly not another of her own species. But her actions suggested that by some invisible means she was drawing that water-dweller after her. Waiting on shore were 2 others of her kind, viewing her actions with close attention, the attention of scholars for an instructor. "Wyverns." Shan looked inquiringly at his companion. Torvald added a whisper of explanation. "A legend of Terra. They were supposed to have a snake's tail instead of hind legs, but the heads, they're wyverns." Wyverns? Shan liked the sound of that word. To his mind it well fitted the Warlockian witches. And the one they were watching in action continued her steady backward retreat, rolling her bemused captive out of the water. What emerged into the blaze of sunlight was one of those fork-tailed sea-dwellers such as the Terrans had seen die after the storm. The thing crawled out of the shallows, its eyes focused in a blind stare on the praying hands of the wyvern. She halted, well up the sand, when the body of her victim or prisoner, Shan was certain that the fork-tail was one or the other, was completely out of the water. Then, with lightning speed, she dropped her hands. Instantly, Forktail came to life. Fanged jaws snapped. Aroused, the beast was the incarnation of evil rage, a rage which had a measure of intelligence to direct it into deadly action. And facing it, seemingly unarmed and defenseless, were the slender, fragile wyverns. Yet none of the small group of natives made any attempt to escape. Shan thought them suicidal in their indifference as Forktail, Shortlegs sending the fine sand flying in a dust cloud, made a rush toward its enemies. The wyvern who had led the beast ashore did not move, but one of her companions swung up a hand as if negligently waving the monster to a stop. Between her first 2 digits was a disc. Torvald caught at Shan's arm. "See that? It's a copy of the one I had. It must be." They were too far away to be sure it was a duplicate, but it was coin-shaped and bone-white. And now the wyvern swung it back and forth in a metronome sweep. Forktail skidded to a stop, its head beginning, reluctantly at first, and then with increasing speed, to echo that left-right sweep. This wyvern had the sea beast under control, even as her companion had earlier held it. Chance dictated what happened next. As had her sister Charmer, the wyvern began a backward withdrawal up the length of the beach, drawing the sea thing in her wake. They were very close to the foot of the drop above which the Terrans stood, fascinated, when the sand betrayed the witch. Her foot slipped into a hole and she was thrown backward, her control disc spinning out of her fingers. At once the monster she had charmed shot forth its head, snapped at that spinning trifle, and swallowed it. Then the Forktail hunched in a posture Shan had seen the wolverines use when they were about to spring. The weaponless wyvern was the prey, and both her companions were too far away to interfere. Why he moved he could not have explained. There was no reason for him to go to the aid of the Warlockian, one of the same breed who had ruled him against his will. But Shan sprang, landing in the sand on his hands and knees. The sea thing whipped around, undecided between 2 possible victims. Shan had his knife free, was on his feet, his eyes on the beasts, knowing that he had appointed himself Dragon Slayer for no good reason. Stay tuned for the next segment from Storm Over Warlock by Andre Norton. Please follow, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. Keep in touch with us on Twitter and Instagram, and recommend us to anyone you know who could use a quiet break or a little help falling asleep. Exploration Dreamland is produced, edited, and hosted by me, Sarah Van Zaley. A big thank you to Project Gutenberg for helping me find this and many other interesting publications. Thanks also to Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com for providing the theme music for this show. The title of this piece is Kalimba Relaxation Music, if you would like to visit his website to hear it in its entirety. Sweet dreams.